Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In today's episode, we'll revisit the end of the Second World War in Europe. Ending the fighting in May 1945 was a messy business, with political manoeuvring, inter-allied tensions, and even last-ditch battles after the war was officially over. Hi Jesse, another week, here we are again, another topic. So this time we're jumping all the way to the right, you might say, to the end of the war, to analyze how the Second World War came to an end in Europe. Quite often we tend to forget that the war continued for quite a few months in the Far East. Some people have called this the forgotten part of the war, the forgotten end of the war. But today we're concentrating on the European theatre, where of course everything comes to an end on the 7th, the 8th, the 9th of May. That's one of the big debates that we need to look into and that we need to analyze. So where do we start with this? I mean, it's a big topic. Where do we begin? What do you think?
Well, as we always say, as usual, I think I'll give a little background. You know, what's the situation? What's happening in these chaotic final days at the end of April, the beginning of May? Because that kind of sets the stage for some of the little teasers that you included in that little intro bit that lead to some of these tensions, that lead to some of these differences, that sort of start to show the little shadow of the Cold War coming, and so on and so forth. So basically, organized German resistance is not that much to speak of once we get into this period of the final days of April and the first part of May, especially in the West. You have the last sort of really big pitched battles already in late March when the Allies cross the Rhine in force. I should say the Americans crossed it earlier in March, but the really mass crossing is a little bit later in March. And then the Ruhr pocket is surrounded. And so essentially the Allies are racing across Western and Central Germany, the Western Allies that is, against sporadic and local resistance. Then on the eastern side, you have the last major operation, the Berlin operation, which surrounds Berlin. Berlin surrenders on the 2nd of May, the remnants of German forces there. And then the Soviets are basically chasing the Germans more or less into central Germany and down into what is now the Czech Republic. At the time, in theory, should have been Czechoslovakia, but was a bunch of other things and occupied and annexed and a puppet fascist state. But I digress. So you have this kind of phase where there are still some Germans fighting, but it's not your normal frontline situation. There's all sorts of chaos because you also have refugees moving everywhere. You have German forces kind of not fighting to stop the enemy, but fighting so that the rest of their comrades can move back and surrender to the Americans, for example. That was a big feature of how the fighting went in the East in those last couple of weeks. And of course, you have all sorts of very unfortunate people on death marches throughout the country, where the Germans were driving them out of various prisoner of war camps and various concentration camps and so on. So this is the kind of chaos that we have in those final days. And of course, Hitler shoots himself in the bunker on April 30th. Despite whatever else you may hear, those of us who still believe in evidence-based historical thinking, this is what happened. So that's kind of the chaos that's going on at this time, which makes it a bit hard to end the war, oddly enough, because clearly the Allies are winning and have won. But war is a complicated human activity. It's also, in a way, a formal and bureaucratic human activity. So you need to have certain procedures in order for these big organizations that we have of armies, right, to do something different, to stop fighting in an organized way. And in this kind of situation that I've just sort of sketched out, that's not easy. When the head of the rival government has killed himself. Then very briefly, someone replaced him. Then someone else replaced him, who's Admiral Dönitz at the end, right, becomes the head of the temporary government, and so on and so forth. So German units are scattered across Europe. Many of them are still up in Norway. Communication, of course, in the German armed forces is breaking down. You have some commanders who want to do their own thing to save their skins or what have you. And this makes it hard to bring an end to this kind of situation. So that was my little intro. Take it from here, Matthias, fill in the gaps and help us understand, maybe from the military point of view, maybe you can expand on that a little bit. How do you formalize a situation of non-war? It's not as easy as it sounds.
It is extremely complex. Dealing with this is extremely complex, as you've just explained. However, I have to do something now, which I've never done before. I have to correct you on one thing. And that, of course, that is when you say that, of course, we all know that Hitler killed himself. As far as I know, he still lives somewhere in Brazil, together with Elvis Presley and Kennedy, and Marilyn Monroe is the housewife. So that's the story I am following here. You're probably alluding to some of these documents that were released recently where people are talking in the 50s, 60s, and even later on that Hitler is still alive. Of course, it's all bogus, it's all bonkers, but what an interesting story. Some really bad films have been made about this as well. So
let's documentary films also.
Let's leave it at that, because otherwise we get carried away and we get too agitated and exercised about this. Let's return to proper history. And yes, you're absolutely right. It is a complete muddle. And it's mainly a complete muddle and confusion on the German side. So you now have a country, you have a political system, and you have a military that's crumbling, that is falling apart. And that's everywhere, and in every scenario, in every example, causes all sorts of issues. So maybe if we unpack that a little bit, and we start, as you already said, with the military. So in the West, the forces are now simply surrendering. There is hardly any organized resistance at that time anymore. So, for example, on 30th of April, this is when Hitler shoots himself, as you mentioned. So that's when the Battle for Nuremberg is over, when the Battle for Hamburg is over. Just think about these names and think about these places, even where they are in Germany. So this is really deep inside Germany. No longer fighting on the Rhine, on the outskirts. Everyone knows by this stage the war is over, the war is lost. And the only reason why the Germans are still really fighting at this stage is not so much because they think they're going to win the war or anything like this, unless you're completely deluded. But it's mainly in order to get more of the soldiers and also the civilians from the eastern territories that are cut off by the Soviets into the West. So the big evacuation, well, you might perhaps argue the biggest achievement of the German Navy in the Second World War. And that also plays a role when you look at how the Germans are trying to play, perhaps manipulate is the right word, the peace negotiations. We return to that later on, because it's all about this. Get as many people out as possible. Get them to the West. Make them surrender to the Western allies rather than to the Soviets. A command structure doesn't really exist anymore. So you still have the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. You then have the Wehrmachtführungsstab, which sits underneath that. And the two famous names related to this are Keitel, who's the head of the OKW. So you might perhaps say, to keep it simple, he's the most senior military officer. Below that, the Wehrmachtsführungsstab under Jodl, so two famous names. So he is basically the operational brain. And then you've got the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy commands. And when you look at where these sit, this, again, is very confusing. So the OKW moved from Berlin, the outskirts of Berlin, to Rheinsberg, which is in Brandenburg. And I'm mentioning this only because, dear listeners, if you are followers of our podcast, you know who my favorite character is. Of course, it is Frederick the Great. And of course, Frederick the Great was put into exile, sent into exile by his father to Rheinsberg. There we are. That's why I'm stressing this point. I think we need to do a podcast on Frederick the Great at some point. So they sit there. From there, they then move further to the north, because the area around Flensburg, so northern Germany, close to Denmark, that is still unoccupied. Air Force Command under Göring went down into Bavaria relatively early on. And this famous episode, dear listeners, if you have seen Downfall, the film, the scene where Hitler has this fit because Göring sends a message back to Berlin and says, well, my dear Führer, I know that you're in Berlin, you're fighting. If you're no longer able to control the war and the war effort, I, as Göring, as the second man in the state, I will take over. So Hitler sees this as high treason, has him fired, has him kicked out of the military, and all this. And he can do that because Göring can do that because he sits in Bavaria. So he's gone there. So you can see they're all over the place. The Navy High Command is up in the north anyway. That's where they sit. But again, they used to be in Berlin. Fascinating building, by the way. Here's the first tangent. Dear listeners, tangents are coming. Tangents are coming. Should you ever go to Berlin and go to the German Ministry of Defense, on the other side of the road, you've got a building which looks quite modern. It was actually built in the 1920s. It was, from an architectural point of view, probably the most advanced building in the world at that stage. It's called the Shell Building, which is now part of the German MOD. And that was the seat of the German Navy Command in World War II. Should you ever go there, have a look at the building. Fascinating stuff happens there as well. They moved to the north as well. So you can see the entire command structure is completely all over the place. You then got the SS, you've got Himmler, who's still there. He's also kicked out of the party and stripped of all his ranks and everything that he holds, because the Allies publish a document from Himmler in which he's trying basically to save his neck. Again, if you have seen Downfall, you will remember this particular scene, because he was in secret talks, negotiations with the Western Allies to end the war and also, of course, to save his neck. So he and his SS entourage went to the west of Berlin, first to Hohenlychen and then a bit further out. And again, you can see all over the place, there is no communication, and that makes it difficult. When you then look at the actual fighting itself, in the West, we already said this now a number of times, the resistance basically just collapses and people just surrender en masse. They know the war's over. They just want to survive at this stage. They know that's the only thing that matters. In the East, it's a bit different. People are still fighting because they're afraid of the Soviets. And you have these pockets that you already mentioned. So by early March, you have a small part in central Germany that's very, very small. You've got the bigger part down in Bohemia, that part of the world, Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. This area is still controlled by the Germans. And then, of course, you've got Scandinavia. So the Germans are still in Denmark. They're still in Norway. About 500,000 soldiers still sit there. I mean, in inverted commas, what a great posting to have as a German in May 1944. It's brilliant.
That would be where I'd want to be.
Here's another little tangent, dear listeners. I remember a long time ago, my boss at Santos, when I was at the military academy, he looked, we had a number of Germans working there, and he said, well, I've just gone through it in my head what you would do during the war. And he said, your job, my job, would be to be defense attaché in South America first, and then probably get a posting to somewhere in Denmark or Norway in late 1944. So I thought that was quite funny and quite clever. So they're still sitting there, 500,000 men. You still got the big Kurland pocket in the Baltic states. So there's still pockets of German soldiers. But of course, you can see that the game is up and they simply can't win anymore. Everyone is just trying to survive.
One element that I think is interesting that often gets discussed about this last phase, and I just want to touch on it briefly, is the question of why didn't the Western Allies push harder? Why didn't they try to, for example, capture Berlin? Now, that's a whole rabbit hole of a tangent that we won't fully go down, but just to keep us in the frame of mind of what's happening in these final days and this buildup of tensions that we're going to talk about then between the Western Allies and the Soviets about how to handle the end of the war and the German surrender, you sometimes hear this idea that the Allies were trying to take Berlin, but of course the Soviets got it first because they were more capable, stronger, so on and so forth. This doesn't really correspond to the weight of historical evidence. The Western Allies purposefully, essentially stopped advancing towards Berlin. There were some generals, especially American ones, but also I think Montgomery, found the idea of making a push to Berlin appealing because, I mean, why not? What a political prize to take. And if you are a military man, of course, your idea is to inflict defeat on the enemy. And what better way of doing that than capturing his capital, right? So Eisenhower basically refuses to entertain this idea. He's much more pragmatic and essentially says, we're trying to win the war from my point of view as a military commander. I'm not trying to create a great political symbol for the post-war situation or a bargaining chip with the Soviets or any of these other things. And why would we spend the lives of our men potentially capturing territory in the eastern part of Germany that our politicians have already agreed is going to revert to the Soviets? And so you already see this kind of jockeying and how the post-war agreements with the Soviets, or the agreements for post-war Germany with the Soviets that were made at Yalta and other places, other meetings and discussions about these occupation zones, how they're already starting to play. I mean, the Western Allies do advance into what will be the Soviet occupation zone, but then they kind of slow things down to a crawl. And what ends up happening is, because of this breakdown that you talked about in the situation on the German side, you do have a government, as we said, in Flensburg up in the north under Admiral Dönitz, but it's a government that's kind of a shell of what a government should be and doesn't necessarily have a ton of influence in the field. And so you have German field commanders who know the situation is hopeless. An interesting comparison is the end of the fighting on the Western Front in the First World War, where we have this one date in mind, November 11th, 1918, the war, quote unquote, is over. It's more complicated than that, because in the East, there's a mess of fighting for years in the First World War. But the difference is, in the First World War, the German army is intact. It's defeated, I would like to emphasize, but it's intact. Its chain of command is intact. Its discipline is intact, mostly. And the German government exists. Yes, they just had a revolution, but there was a government that the military accepted. So you have a whole chain of political and military command that still exists. So when that ceasefire is agreed to, the army respects it across the front. That whole situation doesn't exist in early May 1945. What you end up with is a bunch of local surrenders leading up to, well, we'll get into this too, but leading up to a kind of false start of a general surrender, and then the general surrender. So starting with, I think the first big one anyway, is probably in Italy, where on April 29th, the German command in that area essentially signs a surrender, right? A local surrender, large local surrender for all of Italy and a little piece of Austria, which comes into effect May 2nd. So we think of the end of the war, well, in the so-called Western world as being May 8th. In the Soviet and now Russian space, it's May 9th. We'll also discuss why that's the case, of course. But you already have the Italian front basically coming to an end May 2nd. And then you also have a whole series of these. You have some of them in the first days of May in the Netherlands. You have this German general who needs to be mentioned more often, I think, Johannes Blaskowitz, who surrenders in May in those early days. I think he needs to be mentioned more often because he was one of the very few, another tangent here, one of the very, very few German high-ranking military men who complained about the atrocities in the East. He complained in Poland about the atrocities, and for that he was kind of sent into the wilderness of the bureaucracy until the end of the war when he's brought back. So he surrenders his forces in the Netherlands partially. And you have some others. You have the May 5th, the U-boats surrender. There's almost a general surrender on the British sector of the front on May 4th. And I'm leaving stuff out, which maybe we'll fill in some of those details later. And all of this is before the famous May 8th of the war ended on May 8th / May 9th. That's not the World War I scenario of November 11th, ceasefire followed by peace negotiations. Of course, while you have these sort of ad hoc local surrenders, you have, as you mentioned, a little bit of political back and forth where some of the representatives of the new German government are kind of trying to hem and haw, trying to get more forces to the West, trying to delay, proposing maybe we surrender in the West, but then there's a 48-hour delay until we just surrender in the East. Eisenhower will have none of that and essentially says, no, we're going to keep going. So all this is what leads up to that nice, tidy anniversary date that, we have in our minds.
Very true. It is messy. It is in many ways far messier than 1918. So dear listeners, well, wait for it. We're probably going to have, I don't know how many episodes on this. We were thinking about this or talking about this before, and I said, how many episodes are we going to have on the end of the war? 1, 2, 3 might be stretching it. I think it's going to be 15 or 20. So we see how it goes.
Let's take it one by one.
Exactly. So maybe let's rewind a bit and unpack some of these surrenders that happened before the big date, the 7th, 8th, 9th of May. Again, we'll discuss the dates and why we have these different dates a little bit later. And you're absolutely right. Italy is the first big one. About, roughly speaking, 1 million German soldiers surrender to basically the British, to Harold Alexander, on the 2nd of May. So they signed the treaty on the 29th of April, but keep it quiet and secret for a while. And on the 2nd of May, it then comes into effect. And that, again, is a fascinating one. Not only does it take out the entire southern flank, when you look at the political and the military debates, very interesting to see what the Germans are thinking, what they're doing, who is supporting this whole thing, who is not. So the person who's really pushing for the peace at that particular stage in this area is Fietinghof Scheel. Von Fietinghof Scheel, he used to be the commander of one of the armies in Italy. He is now the German supreme commander of all the forces in this area. He realizes it's all lost, there's nothing we can do, so let's try to negotiate a peace. I was actually, when I was still a student, I was doing an internship at the German military archives, so quite a few years ago, and I was the first one to go through his personal stuff, all the personal files which had found their way into the archive. So I catalogued all that, and there was a lot of very, very interesting stuff on this particular episode. So his involvement in the peace deal and how you're signing this and who's talking to whom. I mean, that's the first question, is how do you approach the Allies without the rest of the state and the Nazi party organizations, without them noticing? And it's really interesting when you look at this, how they do this, because the Germans sent into Switzerland a chap called Karl Wolff. Wolff is one of the most senior SS people that exists. So he, in inverted commas, you might say, from a regime point, ticks the right sort of boxes. Well, or let's say he used to, because when he joins the SS, he becomes Hitler's personal adjutant. He then becomes the liaison officer of Himmler and the SS to Hitler and his headquarters. He then falls out of favor, mainly because he gets divorced and remarries, and Himmler says that's not what should be happening. He's then more or less sacked and relieved of this post, which then stays vacant for a while. And again, I keep talking about downfall. Dear listeners, if you have seen it and you've heard of Fegelein, the famous Fegelein story when Hitler wants him shot and has him executed, he basically takes over this position that Wolff used to have. But Wolff is still there, and he's then moved into Italy as the leader of the SS and the police forces in this area. So you might say a bit of a backwater, but he's still got his rank, he's still got the authority, and he's there. And he's then sent into Switzerland to meet up with an American, Dulles, who later on becomes the head of the CIA. And they negotiate this peace in a meeting in Switzerland. Then they have another meeting in, I think it's Bergamo, if I'm not mistaken. So a secret meeting. And they decide, okay, you know what, let's make peace. And as you said, on the 2nd of May, that comes into effect and the war there is over. Same thing if you move on to the next one. The next big one, again, you already mentioned it, the 4th of May, where you have the German forces surrendering to the British, to Montgomery. And again, that's a big one. It's over 1 million men, because that's all the forces in northwest Germany and all the North Sea islands and in the Netherlands. What's also interesting is that one of the people who is there to sign it on the German side is von Friedeburg. He's a naval guy, and he is the one who's present at all of the major surrenders of the German forces. Why do the Germans surrender to the British and only the northwestern contingent? Well, first of all, they can't surrender the rest of them because they haven't really got the political go-ahead. And again, we'll return to this later. It's still all about getting troops out and civilians out from the east. That's the big problem or the big question that you have in Germany. And of course, as we already said, you have these communication issues. So even if you wanted to surrender more, it would be difficult. The British accept this particular surrender, which is interesting as well, because you then get into this whole debate about, can the Germans do a partial surrender to the Western Allies, yes or no? And this is what the Germans, even at this stage, are suggesting. We are going to surrender all our troops to the Western Allies. But then very, very quickly, particularly Eisenhower gets someone saying, no, that's not happening, because we still have an alliance with the Soviets. And when you move forward a little bit, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, when you go into this debate on the 7th, where the Germans are trying to do exactly the same thing again, the Americans and Eisenhower said, no, you surrender to everybody, or we're going to close our border to German soldiers and you will have to surrender to the Soviets. And he knew exactly what effect that would have. On the 4th of May, the fighting in that part of the world also stops and the war is over. And said another interesting little tangent, should you ever go to the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, where they train the British Army officers, in front of the parade square of what's called New College, you have a big monument. And this is known as the Lüneburg Stone, because this monument was erected on the Lüneburg Heath, where the Germans surrendered. This then becomes a training area, which the British Army of the Rhine uses. And when they hand it back to the Germans, the first thing that the British do is dismantle it and bring it back to Sandhurst, this monument, which says, well, on the spot on the 4th of May, the German forces in Northwest Europe surrendered to Montgomery, because the British were somewhat worried and afraid that handing over this entire training area to the Germans, a German tank might accidentally drive over this particular monument and destroy it. So they brought it back so it's preserved. So if you want to see the original, it now stands at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. So another interesting little story there.
Indeed. So I think one pattern that we're seeing in all of this cascade of local surrenders is, of course, most of these are not happening in the East, right? I think that's for the reasons that we've kind of mentioned and discussed. I do think it's probably worth adding in that in some cases, the German armed forces are not concerned about evacuating civilians. In some cases, they are, of course, out of East Prussia, for example, by sea and so on. But in other cases, like south of Berlin, where you have the shattered sort of Ninth Army, which was in this surrounded Halbe pocket that we talked about in our Berlin episode many episodes ago, they're not worried too much about civilians. In fact, the commander, Busse, basically says the civilians are on their own and we're getting the men out. So there's also a mixture there. There's not even a common policy or a common course of action there. You do have on May 7th, though, German forces in eastern Austria who begin surrendering en masse. This is about 3 weeks after the Battle of Vienna, relatively short-ish battle of 5 or 7 days, or memory fails me, I think 5 or 6 days. The Soviets take Vienna. They're deep into Austria, past my house already for some time. And so you do have some of that. The German garrison in what they would have called Breslau surrenders as well on May 6th. That town, of course, today is part of Poland and known as Wrocław and not Breslau anymore to the outside world, and in case outside the German-speaking world. So you do have a few acts of group or mass surrender in the East, but obviously the motivation is to keep fighting. So this brings us to, I think anyway, it's getting us closer to the first instrument of surrender that was a kind of a bit of a false start, because you can imagine that the Soviets don't look very kindly on all these surrenders that we're mentioning. Already the Soviets, British and Americans, don't like each other and don't trust each other. Already there's a feeling and a sense that once this war is over, not that everyone was predicting the Cold War exactly and the course that it would run, but that we're not going to be super friends, that there's going to be a rivalry, that we're already competing for, the zones of occupation and influence in the Balkans or Iran or what have you. So there's already the kind of foundation being laid for a Cold War type of relationship. And here, from the Soviet point of view, you have your allies accepting partial surrenders of your enemy while your own men are still fighting and being killed. So it's understandable that the Soviets are kind of upset at this. And if you combine that with, Stalin's paranoia, the general ideological assumptions in the Soviet Union that the imperial capitalist powers are not to be trusted and they're always going to backstab you because that's the essence of their civilization or their way of life or what have you, that's a recipe, obviously, for the Soviets being very upset. And they are upset about this. And they do make accusations of the Western allies getting in bed with the Nazis because, ideologically, you're not that far apart from the Soviet point of view. And this tension gets worse, I guess you could say, or takes another step in the wrong direction for the peaceful-minded among us, when the Allies and Germans agree to a general surrender on May 7th. They sign, and there's a Soviet representative who's there in Reims, in France, there's a general surrender that's signed, and it's to come into effect the next day, on the 8th of May. But the Soviets felt that they were not really included in the decision to do this, and they essentially insist that another instrument of surrender be signed. Now, I'm leaving tons of gaps here for you to fill in, Matthias, which is then the one that gets signed in Berlin. So you have this real hiccup at the end where there's a surrender signed in the West for everyone, and then the Soviets don't really accept it, which is a weird way, if I can judge, is a very weird way to end a world war.
You might say it's weird, and it also, to a degree, perhaps you might say it peters out somewhat. You do have the ceremony on the 8th of May or 9th of May, depending on how you look at this. But this is pretty much it. And we'll return to this later on about the consequences of what all this means. Because one thing that the Allies wanted to make very, very clear at this particular stage was that they wanted a military surrender. They wanted the military to appear to sign this document that the German Wehrmacht had lost the war. And the reason, of course, for this is the lesson of the First World War, where exactly that hadn't happened. And you have the civilians signing this, which was then used as the beginning of the step in the back myth of the right-wing factions in Germany after the First World War. Now, you might, of course, look at this and say, well, this is an interesting one, because normally, traditionally, you would have politicians signing a peace treaty, because the start and the end of the war is a political decision. It's not a military decision. You fight the battles, but beginning and ending a war is a political decision. So you need to have political people, they're political representatives, politicians. So in many ways, you might say what happened in the First World War actually makes more sense than what happens in World War II. Because in World War II, when you go now to the 7th of May, what happens there is, so you've got these negotiations, you've got this partial surrender on the 4th to the British, to all these German troops in northwest Germany. The Germans are now trying to negotiate an even bigger deal along the same lines as we've already said. So we're going to surrender all of our troops to the Western Allies while we keep fighting in the East. And open brackets, this whole Hitler idea that, well, the Western Allies would see sense and join the Germans and then fight with the Germans against the Soviets. So basically, in some ways, you might say Hitler was ahead of its time, because that's, of course, well, Cold War and all this being played out in his mind already in early 1945. So you then have this German delegation sitting there and talking about conditions. And again, Friedeburg is there, the German admiral. And he offers this to the Allies and said, this is what we can do, complete surrender. And at this stage, then Montgomery and also Eisenhower, as always said, that's not happening. We want a full surrender to the Allied forces and unconditional, and we want it now. So Friedeburg sends this back to the German government, the Dönitz government, as you already mentioned, which now sits in Flensburg in northern Germany. And they then send Jodl, he is the head of this Wehrmachtsführungsstab, to sign this particular document in Reims, because in Reims, that's where Eisenhower is, that's where the supreme headquarters of the Allied forces in Europe is stationed at that particular time. And that comes with a number of problems, the way they're doing it here. You already mentioned the first one. The Soviets are not all that happy about this, because they do have a Soviet representative. However, they say, well, that guy is not senior enough. The Germans need to surrender to a more senior Soviet general. That's the first thing. The next thing that they then say, and actually they're quite right in this, you can see how legal matters still matter at this point. So the Allies say, particularly the Soviets, okay, you have now a representative of the German military who signed this document. And now it gets a bit confusing and complicated, dear listeners, so bear with me for a moment. This chap is Jodl. Jodl is not the head of the German armed forces. He is the head of you might say, the operational center, but not the head of the armed forces. So the Soviets say, we don't accept this, because he is not the most senior representative. Someone else needs to do this. Someone else, senior than him, needs to ratify this treaty. And this is what the next step is all about. It's not about re-signing it. It's about making it a legal document. And then the next problem that comes in, and that's a problem that everybody sees in the Allied camp, is, of course, the instructions given by Dönitz. So first of all, this whole political charade they're still trying to play, and everyone just laughs at them because this is ridiculous, you've lost the war, so stop playing up like little children, just surrender. And the next problem, of course, that falls out of this one is if you want a surrender by a military person, but these people are getting their instructions from a civilian government, that kind of makes sense. However, the problem is no one recognizes the Dönitz government because they say, well, this is not a normally established legal government, so we don't recognize this. So if you're getting your orders from Dönitz, they are basically null and void. So who's going to sign this peace treaty or surrender document? It's not a peace treaty. We'll return to this later. Who's going to do this? And so the Allies say what happened here is just the first step. We still need to have a second step. And this is then where the Soviets come in and say, well, we need to do it not anywhere in Reims, which doesn't mean anything to anybody, unless, of course, you're French, for a lot of reasons. But everyone else in the world says, well, yeah, okay, there's a nice cathedral there and it is important in French history, very important. But is it a big one? No, you want this to be signed in Berlin. That makes sense. And that, of course, is the next step. And that's why they do this. So you can see all sorts of different levels of complexity. And this whole question of the legality of the German government at that stage is also an absolutely fascinating one. So how does Dönitz become the Reichspräsident? Well, he's just appointed by Hitler in his testament. So you've got him. You then got Krosigk. No one ever has heard of this particular name. He's the finance minister under Hitler, one of the very few ministers who serves from 1933 all the way to 1945. And he becomes the first minister, as it's called. Dönitz says, do you want to become chancellor? He says, no, that sounds a bit wrong. I don't want this, so give me another title. So here's a man, Krosigk, no one's ever heard of probably, unless you're a real history spotter. But he is, you might say, the last chancellor of Germany in 1945. And even from a legal point of view, that doesn't work because you need to have elections. You can't just appoint people. Of course, it all goes back to this question of what is Hitler's role as the Führer. So he combined the offices of Reichspräsident and Chancellor in his hands. So you can see it's a complete muddle. And also when you look at the cabinet itself, it's still quite full of Nazis. So Dönitz is trying to push the SS out and the party organizations, but there's still quite a few people who have a very dark brown history. So that is still very much there. Another reason why the Allies say, we don't really want to work with you guys. And so these just sit there and pretend to be a government all the way into the summer of 1945. And then in the end, of course, they are then basically arrested and put on trial. And then I stopped this because another small tangent here, which is an interesting one also when you look at military trials after the war. There are a number of incidents where people get put on trial, get executed for war crimes or for whatever they've done, sometimes trialed by SS or Nazi judges and lawyers, and they are put on trial for crimes they committed against, that's called the Nazi law. And some of these are executed after the war is over, because you still have this German government that pretends to be working and ruling, and the Allies let them be for the moment, because if they don't really know what to do with it, it's easier if the Germans do all this themselves, let them sort themselves out, and then only later on they are then all, arrested, and the government basically just comes to an end. So this government that hadn't been authorized is just arrested and falls apart, which has very interesting implications for the history of Germany after 45, but I think we park that for the moment and return to that at a later stage, because otherwise it gets very confusing, even in my head.
Yes, the legacy of former Nazi officials and how denazification worked and didn't work is a fascinating topic, and we should tackle that at some stage. However, for today, I think this is a good place to end our first episode on the messy end of the Second World War. We've taken the story from the sort of breakdown of German resistance and governance in late April and early May, through to the complications of local military surrenders, this very strange failed attempt to formally end the war in Reims in France on May 7th. The rest of the story, which isn't just about the surrender document and ceremony and procedures in Berlin, but also about the implications for that, also about battles that continue after that. We're going to take all that up in our next episode. So thanks so much for listening. By the way, listeners, if you like what we do here at the podcast, you can, of course, support us if you so desire. You can also become a part of our online community. You can meet other history buffs. You don't have to torture your wife or partner or husband with all of your stories of what you heard on our podcast and stuff at the dinner table. You can do that with people who want to hear about it. And all that happens on our website, which is at bothsidesofthewire.com. You can even get access to exclusive content in our war room. And if you want a free trial of that, you can use the code word Deep Dark Woods. For now, we'll see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. I think maybe we should change our slogan and code word to "The tangents are coming." This kind of came to me after we've been talking about tangents so much in this episode. Anyway, folks, I'll leave that up to you, people's choice. If you want to hear the tangents are coming on a regular basis, let us know on bothsidesofthewire.com.